For decades, the United States was the world's uranium enrichment superpower, supplying over 90% of global demand at the height of the Cold War. Today, we produce less than 1%. We currently have only limited capacity for low-enriched uranium used in conventional reactors, and no domestic commercial capacity for high-assay low-enriched uranium, which is going to be needed for advanced designs like microreactors and small modular reactors. So here's the question. Can the United States rebuild its enrichment capability? Moreover, why do we have to do this now? We dive into this question and more with Scott Nolan, founder and CEO of General Matter and partner at Founders Fund. I'm Navin Girishankar, and welcome to this episode of Betting on America. Scott, thank you so much for joining Betting on America. I've been looking forward to this conversation. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk through all this.
So this has been a momentous month for your company, General Matter. I think earlier this month in Paducah, Kentucky, you guys broke ground at the gaseous diffusion plant, which had been shuttered in 2013. So you were, in effect, are reviving and resuscitating it. Tell us about that. What are you doing there? What are you aiming to do with the plant?
So, General Matter is a uranium enrichment company, and we are doing that for nuclear energy with the goal of making nuclear energy not only the safest and the cleanest form of baseload, but also the most affordable. So that's the long-term mission. But the immediate goal is restore U.S. leadership in enrichment. And the U.S. used to do over 90% of global enrichment. Now we do less than 1%. And so we're trying to bring that back. That Paducah groundbreaking we did last week was to announce a multi-decade lease at the southern end of the former gaseous diffusion site in Paducah, Kentucky, where we will build our first capacity to perform enrichment operations.
Amazing. And so what you'll be producing there is fuel both for today's conventional reactors as well as fuel for modern advanced design SMRs, small modular reactors, and microreactors. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. And today the U.S. does neither of those things. We have 20% of the grid, roughly 20% of the grid from nuclear in every state. Every household uses some nuclear energy in the mainland U.S. And that 20% is provided for by 94 reactors producing 97 gigawatts. And those 94 reactors today are completely dependent on foreign countries, both Europe and then about 25% from adversarial nations, including Russia and China.
Yeah.
And so that's part one. And then, as you said, those existing reactors use low enriched uranium. The smaller reactors, the SMRs, they'll use enriched uranium that's enriched up to about 20%. And right now we're completely dependent on adversarial countries for that supply. And so our advanced reactor companies, advanced reactor startups don't have a source. And so this site can do both of those things. What it will do first is the low enriched uranium for the grid, but it's also capable of doing HALEU for the advanced reactors.
Yeah, and I want to ask you about these acronyms. I mean, I'm a layperson, so I think the listeners would benefit from you just walking through the enrichment process and what you're adding to that relative to what we currently do not have in the U.S. So maybe ask you to go through that, and then I want to come back to what got you into this business in the first place. But take us through that.
Absolutely. So many people are familiar with reactors. These reactors run on fuel like any engine runs on fuel. This fuel just happens to be enriched uranium. And so I think people are also generally familiar with the idea of these fuel rods that go into the reactor. Once those are used, they become spent fuel, and then those are put to the side and new fuel is brought in. To make that fuel, there's a 5-step process. First, you have to mine the uranium out of the ground. Then you have to convert it into a gas. You then enrich it, which is what we do. You then deconvert it back into a solid form, and you form that solid into fuel pellets of some type. And so those 5 steps, we are the middle step. This is currently the step that the U.S. doesn't do at any scale beyond R&D quantities. And it's why the U.S. is less than 1% of global production of enriched uranium. It's because of this bottleneck. And so this bottleneck is essentially a separation process. It's like a refining process. So when people hear nuclear energy, they hear nuclear fuel. A lot of times they think of radiation, of chemical reactions, of heat coming out. Actually, in our step of the process, there are no chemical reactions, there are no nuclear reactions. It is simply a separative process where we have a chemical that we separate based on its isotope, which is, whether it's U-235 or U-238. And U-235 is the fissile material, and that is what you generally want to enrich up to 3 to 5% to run the reactors that are on the grid today,
Right.
or just under 20% to run the advanced reactors, which allows them to have smaller form factors and be factory built.
Yeah.
And then people wonder, okay, is 20%, why 20%? Is 20% anything risky? And the answer is no. That's an international convention to keep it very, very far away from anything weapons related. To have weapons grade, you're going to over 90%. And so we are only doing enrichment for nuclear energy, and so that is 3 to 5% or just under 20% in general.
Yeah. And just for listeners, when you hear acronyms like LEU, that's low enriched uranium for the existing power plants on the grid, and then HALEU, which is high assay low enriched uranium, is the thing you're saying we have no commercial capacity for that today. And that's like really the sort of cutting edge of the choke point that you're describing. And that's what you're addressing. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, the U.S. does not have commercial quantity production of that, and neither does Europe.
Yeah.
And today it looks like that, that's badly needed by today's advanced reactors. And actually, that need is what led to a Department of Energy program under the last administration that we were named on, and that the current administration is also supportive of. It's a very bipartisan thing that we need to get the fuel supply for the advanced reactors that are going to power the grid.
Yeah, excellent. Actually, Scott, I was struck because at the groundbreaking in Kentucky, you had folks from all the parties, Democrat, Republican, national, local, state, everyone there, which really underscores the bipartisan and truly national nature of this challenge that you're addressing. What I found interesting, two things, which is you're a private investor and a CEO founder, and you are looking at problems that are at the intersection of technology and national security. Really, really fascinating. Like, this is where you can both earn a living, make money, but also it's valuable for the country. And I want to get into that a little bit as to what motivated you to do that. And so I'd welcome your thoughts on how do you get into this business? This is a very, very niche business.
So I was investing for over 12 years full-time at Founders Fund, and a lot of that investing was energy investing. And one energy investment we made, and a company I knew from about 2021, 2022, was a company called Radiant Nuclear, which had a small form factor, 1 megawatt microreactor that could fit in a container. And so starting in 2022, had a lot of discussions with them about what their challenges were likely to be, what the key milestones were. And I had thought coming into those discussions that the hardest thing might be licensing. And they said, no, actually the licensing is very well defined. We just have to go through the process. The hardest thing is finding fuel. And their plan at the time was to import fuel from Russia. And so that naturally triggered a question for me of, okay, why don't the US enrichment companies make this fuel? Is it that much harder to make more enriched fuel to 20% than to 3 to 5%?
Yeah.
And they said, actually, there are no US enrichment companies producing at any scale that would be relevant for us. And so therefore, we have to go overseas. And that triggered a whole investigation throughout 2022 and 2023, where I realized that not only did the advanced reactors have this issue with fuel, but today's grid in the US that relies on LEU was also completely dependent on foreign suppliers.
Right.
One of those foreign suppliers did have a small facility in the US that provides about 30% of what we need, but it's foreign controlled. And, there's this question of, okay, this seems like an energy security problem in addition to a future of nuclear problem. And so these two things together made me realize that the key thing that was missing in the US was enrichment capability, specifically enrichment capability that could be commercial and commercially competitive with Europe and Russia and China. And so that's what we set out to do, is to bring that back in the US.
Fascinating. What's interesting, I was doing some research on your story before we did this podcast, and you kind of went to the core binding constraint in your question. Like, great, nuclear is wonderful, but who's going to produce the fuel, or where are you going to get the fuel? And I think like that's an excellent way to get to the core problem, because it's the intersection of technology and national security and supply chain choke points. And wow, isn't that the binding constraint? And if we can unlock that, there are so many spillovers. And I just found that both inspiring and really quite fascinating in terms of your process.
Yeah, this was actually, there were a lot of analogies to SpaceX where I started my career.
Yeah.
So it's at SpaceX, the US did have a launch capability back then, but the US was trailing Europe and Russia. And at one point after we grounded the space shuttle, we were totally dependent on Russia to get cargo and astronauts to the space station. And so SpaceX set out to do two things at once. One was bring back US capability, but also to drop the price of access to space so that we would get a lot more activity in space. And so what we're trying to do is almost directly analogous, where again, decades later, roughly 2 decades later, we're completely dependent on Russia, but not for the space station launch. It's actually for enriching uranium for our advanced reactors. Yeah. And the US is trailing because we haven't been competitive enough. And so what we want to do is bring that back through commercial competition and commercial competitiveness, but also at the same time, bring down the cost of nuclear so that we see a lot more of it. And so I think, like I said earlier, nuclear is empirically now the safest and cleanest form of baseload. There's general consensus that's not even political, not even bipartisan, but almost apolitical, post-partisan, that we need to scale our grid. And nuclear seems like the way to do that. But if you look to the advanced reactors, they're getting very close to now competing with fossil fuels on price. But at this moment in time, it looks like the fuel will be really the cost driver. And so we see the big lever for not just bringing back US capability, but for dropping the price of nuclear energy and getting a lot more of it as being the reduction in fuel, with enrichment as the largest segment of that cost.
Yeah, wow. There's a lot there. One thing I just wanted to flag, which is, we've done some work on the AI data center build out, and then there are other aspects to reindustrialization in the US that will require prodigious amounts of energy. And if you just look farther out beyond 3 years to 5 years and beyond, it seems very challenging for us to be able to do that without nuclear. And so the fact that you've pointed to the binding constraint on achieving that makes it all the more important and more challenging in a sense. So I found that interesting. The second piece, and you say this, I was reading what General Matter put out, and I'm quoting here: "We will revive nuclear fuel production in America. We chose to do this not because it's easy, not because it's hard, but because it needs doing." I found that really differentiating for a founder investor, like truly differentiating. It needs doing. So why does it need doing? You've laid that out, but you're going into this as an investor and a founder where in most cases people will say, well, that's a government problem to solve. That's a national security problem. That's a government problem to solve. In a sense, you're saying no, like everyone has the opportunity and, in a sense, obligation to address these issues no matter where you sit. Is that how you think about it?
Throughout my career, I've tried to simply work on things that feel important, feel like they're otherwise not gonna get done, and like I can somehow contribute to. And so in this case, we talked about why this is such an important problem for the grid, for energy security, which I think is tightly linked to national security. But really, if you look at it, baseload energy is upstream of all of America's ambitions, whether that's artificial intelligence data centers. As you said, some of these are gigawatt scale data centers, 5 gigawatt scale data centers. That's on par with a city like Philadelphia, which is 3 gigawatts. Yeah. And so we need a lot more power for that. We need power that's affordable for manufacturing. We need power for economic growth. And if you look back to 2010, the US and China had the same amount of grid capacity. In the 15 years since then, China's more than doubled their grid capacity. Wow. So the importance of this problem seems very obvious to me. I think people are realizing this. The DOE even realized it potentially before we did, starting the work behind some of the programs to support LEU and HALEU production. But really, it's this really big picture problem that the U.S. has to address, and it's linked to everything from clean energy to energy growth to national security, energy stability, and we consider all those things general matters, which is part of
Oh, I
our
see.
name.
That's
Um,
great.
and and so the motivation is there on many dimensions where it just seems like, okay, this is one of the most important things to get solved as a country. And then the question was, would this otherwise happen if I did not work on it? Classically, this was something done by the government, but I think we've seen great public-private partnerships over the last few years, whether it's with companies like SpaceX supporting NASA's mission, doing the pieces that they had already proven were very possible, and just commercializing those and driving down costs, allowing NASA to focus on more futuristic missions that were really advancing science and capability versus just doing something that should be industrialized. I think the same thing's true of here on nuclear fuel production. We've had most of nuclear energy industry has been commercialized. This is one step that hadn't been done privately before, not developed privately. And so through conversations with the government, we came to understand that there would be support for a new company doing this and that this was needed and that these things that we saw were important. And then
Yeah.
I think you jump to, okay, well, the formula would be focus on things that are important that otherwise aren't going to happen and that uniquely we can contribute to. And I think that last piece was the key one where in this space, really the right approach was let's do this commercially, let's do this with a private team, and let's have that DNA like SpaceX had, like Anduril had, like
Yeah.
Palantir had, the same formula of outsiders who are going to ask new questions and rethink how it can be done,
Mm.
combined with industry insiders, people from the nuclear industry who know how it works, why it's done that way, and we can question assumptions, question requirements, figure out how do we do this better, faster, safer, cheaper. And so that was the motivation. I think yeah, to me it's just a consequence of wanting to work on things that can be useful, that can make a difference. And so I didn't worry about that distinction between operating, investing. I've done both in my career. In this case, it seemed like obviously the right thing was to help and to go into an operating role here.
Yeah. Truly fascinating and interesting set of lessons on how innovation takes place or can take place, particularly in really hard nuts to crack, hard, difficult areas that have largely been ignored, or where we took our eye off the ball. So that's really interesting. Now, speaking of hard things, you got started in Kentucky, and I just wanted to ask if you play that forward, some of the challenges that you see in sort of finishing the swing on what you've started there. So the things that I was considering, and I wanted to get your thoughts on it, are the workforce issues, workforce school skills. How do you source, train, and retain talent in such a specialized industry? And also, what are the adjacent industries that you think are important, that are necessary as part of the value chain that you're working on?
Yeah. And in Kentucky, I mean, we view this as just the start. We're just at the starting line, and now we get to go do all the hard work that's required to bring back this capability.
Yeah.
About Kentucky, the reason we picked Paducah over any other site was those dimensions that you just talked about. It really came back to the community. So we looked at over 1,000 plots of land in 11 states over the past year, met many, many communities, and Paducah was by far the most educated on enrichment, the most supportive, and obviously the right place for us to go. And so we did that in a really exhaustive process. I think a shortcut would have been just saying we should go to the community that most recently enriched uranium, that has the expertise, that has the workforce, and that is Paducah. And so
Mm-hmm.
on those things that you asked about, how do we get the workforce? I think a lot of it's already there. You have people that worked at the gas distribution plant as recently as 2013
Yeah.
and who are currently working on the site to decommission the site. And so there's a lot of people in proximity, currently about 2,000 working on the site right now. Our site, our facility, is going to have in steady state for the current phase of production about 140 employees. And so within that population in Paducah, we're very confident that we're going to find the right people there. And so that side of things, I think, is we feel really great about. This is the right community for it. Extremely supportive community. On other things like licensing, we feel just like that reactor company I mentioned at the beginning, the path is very well defined. The licensing path, it takes some time, but it's very clear what we need to do, and we're ready to do that work, and we've already started engaging with the NRC on that work. And so I think the final piece of it is really the construction piece, the infrastructure piece, which is up to us. We need to do the building. We need to do the same thing that you saw other companies like Tesla do in Reno, build factories. That's not something the U.S. Has been as good at, but when it's really custom industrial work, in our case, our buildings are going to be not that different from something like a car manufacturing facility. There will be specific equipment inside of the facility, but the facility itself will be not that different from a data center. And so, our team is going to do that piece of the work as well. Work with outside contractors on that, people who have expertise combined with people who have led those projects that are on our team. And so that is the hard work that has to be done, but we feel really great about doing it. And we think that all that can be done to bring the facility online before the end of the decade, and that is our goal.
From your experience at SpaceX, from your current experience at General Matter, you're in effect reindustrializing the United States in advanced technologies and in new industries of the future. And in this case, it's reviving something that we had sort of wither on the vine. One of the big challenges for reindustrialization that we're tracking here at CSIS is the impact of the trade war and tariffs. Have you thought about that, and is that affecting you in any way? Is that a positive? Is it a net negative? Is it something that still has to play out, given the complex value chain that you're working on?
Yeah, regarding tariffs and trade, that hasn't been a big factor in things so far. Certainly not in us starting the company. And so, the real impetus was advanced reactors need fuel. The grid needs fuel. The U.S. can do this better. We can do it better than we ever have with modern technology, and we can bring the cost down. And so, if we take a step back and say, what have been the actions that have led us here over the last few years? There's been a lot of support for nuclear, even ahead of any discussions of renegotiating trade with other countries.
Yeah.
2020, you had the Energy Act, you had the HALO Availability Program, you had the Senate Advance Act, all of these things extremely bipartisan, not having anything to do with U.S. relationships with other countries, really just about how do we bring back our own capability.
Right.
And so now on the topic of now going forward into trade, into the tariff and trade topic, I think utilities have had to struggle with this and think through, where are we going to get our uranium? Where are we going to get those enrichment services? I think one big important backdrop for this on the uranium side was actually an act of Congress, again, bipartisan last year, around banning Russian imports, including uranium.
Right.
And so those imports were banned starting last year. There's a waiver process that allows them to still come in because utilities really do need the uranium we're bringing in. But that waiver process ends on January 1st, 2028. And so that's the line in the sand that we see as a real timeline driver, and why we're trying to be online as soon as possible, and why we will absolutely be online before the end of the decade. But I think a lot of the specifics around nuclear, around uranium, have been more about Russia in particular in the short term, not about tariffs broadly. Although of course China intersects with that, as well as China tries to start importing uranium into the U.S. to displace the Russian uranium. So this will be a topic going forward, but how we got here is about totally different things. And I think maybe one other point to make on just the total support for this reindustrialization in nuclear, in addition to all these other areas we're seeing in the country right now, is this concept of the federal government really wanting to see federal lands be used to do this work. And so this was actually something I shouldn't gloss over in Paducah, was this lease with the DOE around the environmental management. And as they cleaned up this site, they said, before we're done cleaning up, we can actually start reindustrializing now. And that was a key part of our lease at the southern end of the site. So it's been this confluence of support from across the political spectrum for these efforts, as you've seen in other industries.
Yeah, it's such a great point to make because a lot of times we're focused on how polarized the politics are. But in fact, even in the midst of that, there are important bipartisan initiatives around things that matter to our national security and our economic security. And you've kind of highlighted an example of that. I do want to go back to the question on the role of government. You highlighted that earlier on about public-private partnerships. You talked about SpaceX. You talked about General Matter and what you're doing. Let's just linger for a minute on the executive orders that President Trump issued. I saw you were at the White House when he signed them, a number of them around nuclear renaissance and really nuclear energy overall. There is a perspective out there, and it may be narrow, but I'll raise it, that there's an emphasis on deregulation solving a number of problems. You've actually have a different take on this, which is that it's, if I understand it correctly, re-regulation. What do you mean by that?
I think of it much more as re-regulation than deregulation. The four executive orders, as you said, if we just walk through them, one was around the DOE, providing a licensing pathway through the DOE for really test reactors, R&D reactors. The thinking there being these advanced reactors we haven't really deployed. They're not really been commercialized. They could be tested and should be tested on DOE land and proven there first. And so that was one of the executive orders to provide a pathway there for the DOE to host a lot of those tests and to let reactors get started there. So I think of that as new regulation, not undoing regulations. It's creating new regulation for how that could be done. On the NRC side, it's not saying that the NRC should reduce its safety evaluations in any way. It's re-regulating to make it more like the FAA in some ways, where the FAA has to factor in the fact that flying has massive economic and social benefits to the country. There is some risk every time anyone gets on an airplane, just like anytime we get in a car, but we don't ban cars or airplanes. Until today, the NRC, until these executive orders and the Senate Advance Act last year, the NRC's mandate in the actual charter of the NRC was much more about let's make nuclear as safe as we can and reduce risk, without explicitly factoring in the need to account for the benefits of nuclear. So I think that one is an update as well. You also had a DoD executive order, which mandated that the DOE should also test and deploy reactors, and it provided a DoD siting pathway there. So new regulation, not deregulation. And then finally, the fourth executive order was about reindustrializing the nuclear supply chain, whether that's conversion or enrichment or workforce or other pieces. And so I think just broadly what we've seen is the administration has said, let's just take a step back. Let's think of how we got here. Let's ask ourselves what we're doing, if it still makes sense, in light of, all the progress in nuclear, all the empirical data that says it's the safest form of baseload, and now being multiple generations ahead of those reactors that were deployed on the grid, which were Gen 2, Gen 3. We're now at Gen 4. And so, I think a lot of progress has been made, and the goal is, that the administration has taken is let's just rethink this and try and do it the smartest way we can, because something seems off when the cleanest, safest form of baseload is not the thing that's driving our grid and not something that we've really expanded in decades. And so, we need to do something new. So I think that's the way I've interpreted it. And seeing the work that's been done so far has been encouraging.
Yeah, certainly an interesting perspective. Your perspective on this is valuable. Of course, I would just flag that there is a lot of debate on some of the elements of the executive order, particularly the NRC piece, perhaps for another conversation. But I think what I'm really interested in is your own thinking coming on the other side of those EOs and the launch at Paducah on the role of government and the balance between public support and private initiative. This is kind of modern industrial strategy, and I would say relative to the previous administration, this administration has a different approach to it. But what's really a common thread across those is the need for public and private to work together to solve the biggest challenges, economic security challenges, national security challenges that we face as a country. And this is a great case in point. I'd love your reaction to that.
Yeah, if you look at what's really made the U.S. the leader in the world, it's capitalism. It's allowing the ingenuity and innovation of private market to really push industries forward. I think planned economies in other countries have proven to be very difficult to run. They're slower. Maybe you get some centralization, some coordination, some long-term planning that can have advantages, but I think it comes at such big disadvantages that the U.S. ultimately has, and I think will continue to win on free markets and capitalism and innovation. And so, I think the partnership between public and private, between government and private companies, public companies, can really unlock both of these, where the government can say, here are the things that we really want to happen. Here's the support because this in some ways is a public good. This is highly strategic for the country. Government investment in this area is going to achieve huge dividends and serve everyone. And I think the government can say those things and create these programs and then compete it in the private markets.
Yeah.
This is what happened with NASA and SpaceX. In 2026, NASA created a program called Commercial Orbital Transportation Services that they put out to bid. They let a number of companies, any company could put in a proposal for that. They ultimately selected SpaceX and one other company to compete and to execute against milestones, and only get funding if the milestones were achieved. So that was a way of creating almost like a government X Prize, saying, if you do this thing of bringing back launch capability, going to the space station, bringing cargo up, we will help support that with government funding, and we will set what that path and vision is, and we will see who can execute on it. And I think that's a great way to do public-private partnerships, where the government says, here's what's important to us, here's what we think is extremely strategic, here's some money, we want to see private money brought alongside that to execute this thing, and we are going to really hold people's feet to the fire. We will have milestones. The funding will not come until you do the thing, and I think that's a great model. It's been proven to be successful, and it's ultimately what took the U.S. from really third place in the world on launch to now first place by far. And we're seeing so much more activity that's unlocked other things in commercial space. So that to me is the model, and I think we're now seeing that in a bunch of different areas with the government working with private industry, and I think we should see great results out of that.
Yeah, I'm so glad you raised this, and the way you described it is, I think, quite meaningful and something that I hope the listeners will pay attention to for the following reasons. One is you're describing government as a tailwind, not a headwind for private initiative, and I think it's worth investigating what's needed on the part of government to do that. Like, there are different ways we can think of industrial policy and industrial strategy, some bad, some good. And I think there's an agility that you're describing on the part of government that's needed to be developed systematically across different sectors and different departments. And I don't necessarily think that that's always there. And that's probably the basis for what could be a very interesting public sector reform agenda going forward to support the kinds of things that you're doing. Do you have a thought on that?
I would agree. This is something we've seen the last few years with a range of startups that have worked with the government. I think it's something Andrew has talked about a lot, that procurement in the DoD has changed, where the DoD will much more often now say, here's what we need to have done from a mission perspective. Here's the capability we want. We will no longer tell you exactly how to do it. We will not specify every detail, but we will identify milestones and deliverables that we are willing to pay for because it's strategic, because it's important, and because it's a national capability. And that model seems to work well because you can unlock the innovation of private industry to say, here's how it's been done, but maybe here's how we think it could be done much better, faster, cheaper, safer. And so I think that's what we've seen in defense. I think we're now seeing that in many different areas of government. And so the model seems like the right one, where we can still have the government identify what's important and how important is it, and prioritize things and prioritize spending, and then let private industry do its best to really get the most value per dollar.
You obviously had a long history at Founders Fund, working with Peter Thiel. You're now in this new incarnation, really running a company, but also associated still with Founders Fund. There's something that I read about in terms of your own history and journey, the notion that competition is for losers, the idea that the most valuable companies create markets rather than sort of fighting for scraps. And when you apply that to this hard set of issues around technology and national security, I wonder whether that ethos is what's driving you, or that investment philosophy, it's what's driving a lot of the things you mentioned in whether it's SpaceX or uranium enrichment, or potentially other things like life sciences. Do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, that quote is, it's a short, pithy one-liner.
Yeah.
That I can't take credit for. That's a quote from Peter Thiel many years ago, where I think he was trying to summarize this concept of, that's maybe the negative or inverse way to describe the way I think of another another framework I've heard from him, which is work on things that are important, that otherwise won't get done, and that you uniquely can do. And so, if you take those three things, the inverse of that is work on things that are not important, that a million people are working on, and that you have no differentiation in, which I think that worst case scenario on three dimensions can be summarized in that quote, that you want to avoid competition. If many people are already doing it, if it's already going to happen, if you have nothing new you can bring to the equation, why do that? Why dive into the pure, world of pure competition where it's a lot of effort, and your efforts could much better be spent on a problem that's not going to happen, or that you can uniquely do and push an industry forward. And so, I think it's that whole contrarian framework of what's the important problem that no one is solving, what's the important company that no one's building. And so, yeah, throughout 2022, 2023, this problem of bringing back U.S. capability in enrichment, in fuel production, and as a tailwind for all of nuclear, that just seemed like the important problem that no one was solving that we needed to solve.
Yeah. Just to build on that, I was reflecting on the fact that there's been a lot of talk in recent years around patriotic investing, private initiative, but directed towards national security, or let's just say national interest type goals and sectors and investments. And I wonder whether what's emerging, and you've your whole journey has been a lot of this. What's emerging is something like patriot investors, meaning people who are directing their thinking as investors, which is a hard thing to do, but towards a set of problems that have all these national spillovers or national interest spillovers. It's not an easy thing. The easier thing sometimes is to focus on where one can make a quick buck. But this is really interesting. And is it emerging? And is this something that we can look to folks like yourselves in the private sector to do more of this? Because in a sense, how else are we going to do it in our system?
Right. I think you are seeing a lot more of this. You're seeing it from everything from software for the government to defense tech to now things in the nuclear space, energy broadly. I think the catalyst for a lot of this was seeing China's growth the last few years and China's competitiveness, and them doing things like growing the grid much more than we have, and us realizing that in a world of us being completely dependent on Taiwan for chips and semiconductors, that this is a highly dangerous strategic position to be in, and there's a lot of things that we haven't been doing since the 90s that we need to go fix. And no one group is to blame for that. This was consensus starting in the 90s that things that the U.S. didn't do better than anyone else, we should simply offshore and let other countries do. And that was behind a lot of the decisions across U.S. capability. Again, both parties. It just seemed like post the Cold War, we were in a world of free trade. We can let these things go overseas, and it won't have strategic implications because, we will just use free trade to get what we need.
Yeah.
And while that's a nice ideal, I think just seeing the evolution the past few years, people have realized we do need to bring a lot of this back, and it shouldn't come purely as a cost. It should be something where with modern technology, hopefully we can do it much better.
Yeah.
And I think that's the common thread to a lot of this. Everything from defense tech to energy to semiconductors, many different
Yes.
companies and founders working on this. I think investors doing it has been the rarity.
Yeah.
If you look at how many companies are working on these problems, it's certainly hundreds. I think the ones that are, run or incubated by investors is probably in the tens. So I think it's still a minority, but in the case of Founders Fund, it's not something that's been done programmatically. I think, you look at this and, you look at Andrilla was founded in 2017 in response to feeling like nobody was taking the right approach on defense. You have Palantir in early 2000s, getting started to address this question of national security versus loss of data privacy and how do we preserve both. And so for Founders Fund, it has not been something where we've said that this is something thematically that the fund ever wanted to do. It was almost one-off situations where after spending a lot of time in a sector and realizing that it didn't feel like anyone had cracked the problem, that there was this one approach that had to happen, and eventually with enough searching and realization that nobody was doing it, it got back to that framework of what's the important problem no one's solving, and maybe we just have to do the hard thing of actually building that company.
Can that ethos be brought into government more systematically? Because I can imagine a situation where if you're relying on unique individuals like yourself and the people you work with at Founders Fund to solve these hard problems, they may have limited capability or time to focus on a set of problems. But as a nation, we have to solve a number of these hard challenges. And so my sense is that simply relying on the private sector to do that without government also saying, well, actually, don't forget that one, and don't forget that problem, and don't forget that problem. We won't get there unless we have both, right?
Yeah, I think the government has a huge role to play in this. I think we've seen efforts within the government to do this the last, decade or two, everything from Digital Services Agency and the Obama administration to DOGE and the current administration, where I think both were really about how do we increase capability inside the government? How do we get people who have operated in the private sector to bring their experience into these problems and approach it in a fresh way? And then really, how do we give the people inside the government as much authority to try new things as possible? How do we get away from, existing process? While it's important, how do we try to free that up somewhat to focus on substance and give these subject matter experts the breadth to go make the changes that might be necessary as the world's changed over the last few decades? So I think internal to government, bringing that expertise in and letting the people who are already there do the things that they know need to be done. I think that's a theme that hopefully we see more of. And I think it's been, there's been attempts the last few decades over that across both parties. But of course, changing existing systems can be really difficult. Changing big organizations, whether it's the government or private industry, is extremely challenging. And so I think that's where the role of new organizations, whether they're new private companies or other entities, can supplement that. So I do agree with you where the government can outline, here are the needs we have, here are the things private industry should be focused on, here's how we can change internally and allow more room for innovation and progress, and not worry about process as much as the substance of it and moving the country forward.
Yeah.
So I think that's hopefully an attitude we see more and more this century, and then letting private industry to the greatest extent possible execute on those things where it's appropriate, where we can create as much competition and innovation and again get the most value per taxpayer dollar is I think something everyone should be able to agree on.
Yeah.
That we just want most effectiveness for government resources that we can get.
Yeah, so well stated. And, this podcast is really around ultimately how one stays ahead of the tech race. And for me, I think of innovation and diffusion, and the goal is clear, but how you get there, we need to be very, very flexible about how we do that. And we have to be flexible of how we do that while still faithful to what is unique and quintessentially American. And you've laid that out. And so let me end where we started. You started with the story of what's happening in Paducah, Kentucky, and uranium enrichment and the hard task that you have embarked on. And I think about enablers of the tech race. And in a sense, what you have your finger on there, Scott, is an enabler of enablers. Because if you don't get at what you're talking about, you won't get to the nuclear generation that we need and power generation that we need, and all the other things that flow out of that, AI and other industries and manufacturing. And I think you've put your finger on something, and we're going to be watching what you do, and I really wish you the best, and thank you for sharing all your insights on this topic.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you for joining this fascinating discussion with Scott Nolan, founder and CEO of General Matter and partner at Founders Fund. You can find this episode of Betting on America and more at csis.org, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is Navin Girishankar reminding you that everyone has a role to play in winning the tech race.